Welcome, everyone, to the live stream panel discussion, How to Promote Longevity, moderated by myself, Keith Comito, president of the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation, or LEAF, and brought to you as part of the rewards for everyone who contributed to the Major Mouse Testing Program, or MMTP, campaign on our longevity research crowdfunding site, lifespan.io. So in this panel, we'll be talking about the MMTP project, which involves the hot topic of senolytics, or drugs that clear out unhealthy cells in the body, other potential breakthroughs in research to extend the healthy period of life, and finally about bottlenecks and complications in longevity research and advocacy to see if we can brainstorm together solutions to help increase the pace of this research. So we'll also be trying to monitor any comments in Facebook. So if you have anything you want to ask us or whatever, just drop those comments and we'll try to bring that in. But before we start, I guess we'll begin by introducing our panelists and hear about maybe a little bit more about why you actually care about this topic. So you've already met me, so I guess we'll begin with Dr. Oliver Medvedik right here, Vice President of LEAF and Molecular Biologist Extraordinaire.
Yes, and we are broadcasting right now from the Cambar Center for Biomedical Engineering here in Lower Manhattan, Cooper Union, of which I'm the director of. And I don't know, what should I say?
Guys, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Oh, hey.
Oh, hey, Aubrey.
There's Aubrey.
Well, I guess you can be the next one to introduce yourself, Aubrey, since you just jumped in. So there you go.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm Dr. Aubrey de Grey. I'm the Chief Science Officer of Science Research Foundation, and I'm not in favor of aging.
All right, it's about as good as introduction as any. So we're just making the rounds right now, Aubrey, just introducing yourself. So next we'll go to the MMTP members. So starting with the lead researcher, Dr. Alexandra Stolzing of the University of Leipzig, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alexandra, and as Aubrey, I'm not in favor of aging, and that's one of the reasons why I got involved into the crowdfunding. I'm a biologist by training, and that's it. So that's me.
Excellent, excellent. Next up, some more from the MMTP team. Steve Hill.
Hello there, you kind of caught me surprise there. Surprise, I'm the project lead for the MMTP. My stock in trade is statistical data analysis and administration. So basically, I'm the person that shouts at everyone and tells them that they're spending too much money. So that's it really. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Leaf Foundation.
Yes, you're probably, if you're on Facebook, you're probably familiar with seeing Steve's face blast everybody on different Facebook groups. So next is Elena Milova, a fundraising and outreach coordinator for LEAF and the other half of the MMTP campaign team. So go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, hi everyone. Well, my duties are mostly the advocacy part of our projects. And it's awesome actually to communicate with the general public and to talk to a lot of like-minded people when we are doing our projects. So nice to hear all of you, and I hope you will enjoy this discussion.
Great. And last but not least, we have one of our donors who actually contributed to the MMTP campaign, and that's why they're able to join us today. So that would be, hopefully I say your name right, Alen Akhabaev, student of the University of Cambridge. Akhabaev, there you go. So student of the University of Cambridge with strong interest in longevity and leading you to become the president of Cambridge University Longevity Society. Is that correct, Alen?
Yes, I founded the society, and I'm trying to promote the cause in Cambridge, UK.
Excellent. Okay, so now that we're all friends, we can start with the actual discussion proper. So I think a good way to kind of start things off is to set the stage with talking about the MMTP, since that's what's brought us all together. So maybe Steve, you can just kind of briefly explain the project overall, and then we can go to Alexandra for some details on the research.
Right, how to sum MMTP up in a nutshell. Well, I mean, it was originally a project started by a gentleman called Edward de Bonnier, and he was part of the ILA, is part of the ILA, I should say, pardon me. And what he wanted to do was help speed up research. So he had the idea of creating the MMTP originally, and it sort of gathered steam from there. And we decided to test a variety of compounds originally, but as the sort of interest in senolytics took off, we sort of honed in on that, and we thought, well, that's probably where we're going to have the most impact. And it sort of escalated from there. And then we bumped into you guys and we're like, hey, lifespan, I like the sound of this. Let's get it done. And within 6 months of me and Elena joining the team, as you know, Keith, we organised and launched the project. It was all rather quick, actually. And that was it. We've been on the roll.
Would you remind people just a little bit about why working on the problem of senescent cells is so important? Because it's maybe obvious for us, but not so obvious for other people, probably.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem. Once you sort of know things off by heart, you forget that not everyone does. Well, I mean, senescent cells are a real problem because they accumulate as you get older. Normally, they get disposed of by the immune system, and they destroy themselves, with a self-destruct program. But they stop clearing as you get older, and they cause lots and lots of inflammation, and then they then encourage diseases. So years ago, a rather famous person suggested, "Oh, let's remove them," and that's what the aim of Senolytics is, and that's what we're testing. We're testing to see whether certain compounds and chemicals and substances can kill these cells off that we don't want, and then hopefully the sort of result would be you'll be healthier, less inflammation, and less prone to getting age-related diseases. Certainly works in mice, and we're hoping to help do our bit towards getting it to humans.
Great. So I think probably where most of our viewers might have heard of this topic before is probably with Unity Biotech, and that they landed a huge deal for looking at Senolytics. So maybe Alexandra, you could tell us a little bit about what approach we're using here with the MMTP, or you're using with the MMTP, and how maybe contrast that a little bit with what Unity is doing, and give people a sense of the landscape of the research that's being done here in this topic.
Okay, then maybe let me explain a little bit about the MMTP. Lifespan we want to be like a platform. So this is just the initial project, and the way we see it is that we are the place and we're the person to go to if you have a new compound that might be in Senolytics, like in case of Unity, maybe they have come up with something new, or you can come up with your own idea, and we are just here to test. So we don't have our own kind of like product or anything. We're just the testing platform, and that was also the original idea of Edward, having a place to go to and do loads of compounds together. We decided to kind of look what is known already about the Senolytics, because we're not the first one to do it, and we're not the first one to test them in mice. So our idea just was to combine whatever is known to be working well and just test it in mice, and more or less just set the scene and set the system up and show we're capable to do other communities, pharma, and say like, hi, here we are, you can test your stuff with us. And we don't have really any contact to Unity or so. We could have these contacts, but currently we're not into researching new senolytic compounds, so that's not our job.
Gotcha. So more of setting up a process of how this problem can be looked at in an efficient way. Gotcha. So Aubrey, obviously, one of your claims to fame is sort of classifying the different disease types of, senolytics, senescent cells being, in a sense, one type of them. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how exciting you think this area is to work in compared to others, and maybe a few of the other damage types that you think have really promising therapies that could happen in the near term?
Sure. So, yes, as you know, I have for well over 15 years now been discussing the value of looking at repair of damage in one form or another as a way to postpone, perhaps indefinitely, the ill health of old age. And a big part of how this can be made into a practical approach to the development of such medicines is to classify the many, many types of damage that the body does to itself into this rather manageable number of categories. I normally talk about 7 categories. The main purpose of this is to organize our thinking really around how we might develop damage repair strategies. One of the 7 categories I often talk about is the loss of cells. In other words, cells just dying and not being automatically replaced by other cells. And that has been a nice kind of emblem of all of this because, of course, the way to fix it is simply to put new cells back using stem cell therapy, prepare cells in the laboratory into a state where they know what to do to replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And, as a kind of paradigm, that was nice and easy to explain. But what I really needed in order to be able to communicate this more forcefully would be a second example, something which was not previously considered to be particularly practical, or at least not particularly popular and established, but which rose to that level of realism and plausibility. And of course, what Unity and other groups have succeeded in doing around the senescent cell area is precisely that. The whole idea of eliminating these cells as a genuine rejuvenation therapy as part of the way to actually turn back the clock of aging rather than just slow it down has got people to take rejuvenation much more seriously as a generic approach and to focus less, well, at least less exclusively on things like calorie restriction, mimetics and such like that don't eliminate pre-existing damage but only attempt to slow down the further accumulation of damage. Now, in a sense, what we actually have is we don't have senescent cells per se as a category. We define the category a little bit more broadly as what I often call death-resistant cells, cells that get into a state where they're doing more harm than good, but for whatever reason, the body does not eliminate them. And the reason I define it more broadly is because there are certain examples, there's at least one very important example of cells which are not senescent in the classical manner as defined by what genes they express in a bad way or anything like that, but rather, they are in some way a different kind of death-resistant cell, a different kind of problematic cell. This is in the immune system, cells that are designed to get rid of particular infections. In certain cases, these cells are unable to get rid of the infection and they get repeatedly reactivated every so often during life. And eventually they just get pissed off, basically. They just get into a state where they don't really do the right thing. And in particular, they hang around, and there is a widespread belief anyway that these cells inhibit the rest of the immune system. In other words, they contribute quite significantly to the fact that the immune system doesn't actually operate terribly well late in life. So we want to eliminate those cells as well. Now, what we're doing in this space is, of course, we are recognizing that other people, such as Unity, are pursuing very important angles here. And we're always looking, since we're such a small organization, we're always looking for ways to get the best bang for the buck and complement what other people are doing, which is largely why we have done very little in the stem cell space ever since we were created. We have actually been relatively modest in our contributions to the senescent cell, the death-resistant cell space. We've had a couple of projects over the years in that area. We're constantly, revisiting and updating what we do in that kind of way. So at the moment, we feel that, first of all, the approach of looking for genuine senolytics, in other words, small molecules that can selectively kill senescent cells, is going very well within the auspices of Unity, among others. And in addition to that, the approach that we have felt was probably the most promising, but which is a bit more elaborate, namely the use of genetic ways to kill cells using what's called suicide gene therapy, that too is now being taken forward quite successfully within the private sector. There's a company that is very closely allied with Sense Research Foundation called Ocean Biotechnologies, OISIN, it's a Celtic word from Ireland. And they're very much looking at this approach. They have technology that's very nicely optimized for delivering DNA to cells in a manner that's perhaps superior to the standard things that have been used for somatic gene therapy. So we're quite keen on pursuing that and helping Ocean to move forward rapidly. And I'm pleased to say that even though they haven't been able to secure the same kind of funding that Unity have, they've still, they have been quite successful in securing sufficient funding to be able to do what they want to do for the short term anyway. Now, our personal activities as Sense Research Foundation in this space are actually now focused on a third approach to eliminating death-resistant cells, which is being pursued at the Buck Institute in the lab of Judy Campisi, who is, of course, one of the absolute world leaders and has been for a long time in this area, and has also been a huge friend of ours for 20 years. So the approach that we're taking there is to actually try to improve the ability of the immune system to get rid of these cells. It was mentioned earlier by Steve that the immune system already naturally is pretty good at getting rid of senescent cells, but not perfect. Somehow or other it misses some. And there's a huge amount not known about exactly what's going on there. We don't even know such fundamental things as whether the reason why senescent cells accumulate is because the immune system gets progressively worse at eliminating them with age, or whether, conversely, there is throughout life some kind of spectrum, a certain subset of senescent cells that are inherently resistant to being eliminated by these mechanisms, even in youth. We just don't know that. It's a pretty fundamental thing not to know. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be exploring over the next while in Judy Campisi's lab.
Excellent. Yeah, I personally am very excited about Senolytics as well, and that's why 2 of the projects that we've done at Lifespan have been focused on that. Another thing that I think is cool about Senolytics is that, at least I've heard from a couple of conferences that we've been to, is that senescent cells can also arise as sort of a side effect of other things like chemotherapy. So because of that, it sort of allows even more inroads for sort of researchers to work on it in a more, immediately accessible way. Even if there's still a little bit of a stigma of working on aging, you can say, well, I'm trying to help rescue the behavior of people with chemotherapy, et cetera, and that should make it a lot easier to sort of get buy-in into that. So that's cool.
Well, it certainly opens up the funding avenues, right? Because the more directions you can get funding, because you're tackling the same question essentially from a different approach. So,
right.
It's great.
Cool. So to kind of pivot this, I know, Oliver, we've talked about this before. What do you think, how much, if you had to put a guess on it, how successful do you think just clearing out senescent cells by itself would be as far as health span and lifespan versus maybe pairing it with something like a stem cell therapy?
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly, as Aubrey alluded to earlier, there's still a lot of fundamental questions that need to be answered. But if I were to, based on what I've read so far, I personally would think that would be half of the solution, right? So if you're clearing out stem cells, that's fine. You're now making the environment more tolerable for all the surrounding cells, but as a consequence, or is as a consequence clearing out your stem cells, are you also depleting senescent cell? Are you depleting your somatic stem cell reserve? I mean, that's another big question. How many somatic stem cells do we have, right? We have over 200 different cell types. And does the number of somatic stem cells decrease over time? Some studies suggest perhaps it does. And will just clearing out stem cells, not lead to an increased lifespan just because you are now depleting somatic stem cells? So would that then need to be
replace? Right,
would that need to be coupled with some sort of replacement? But still, there needs to be some basic research that needs to be done to answer some of those questions. Just to kind of shore up some of the hunches I have right now.
Sure. Does anybody want to respond to any of that? Feel free to jump in. I see Elena has her hand up, so Elena.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Alexandra about this because she's a famous specialist on stem cells and probably she has a vision. So Alexandra, if you may comment on this.
What, of how much extra lifespan we get if we get rid of senescent cells? I wouldn't predict that. It will have.
No. I mean, just how much Senolytics might be dangerous in terms of the stem cell pool. Should we expect this therapy somehow interfere with the numbers of functional stem cells we have?
It's actually a concern of mine, like that, because the way Senolytics work is that they are kind of like targeting specific cell types with a specific genetic kind of makeup, and a bit are stem cells having the same makeup as senescent cells. They're not releasing any harmful factors, but definitely they're kind of similar. And that's bits of things we're doing in the lab right now, is to look at like how senescent or like how are Senolytics affecting stem cells. I think that's a question which we can't answer. We have to just simply test it. But definitely I'm kind of concerned that you would get rid of some of your good stem cells. Maybe it's just targeting cells you want to get rid of, but unless we have tested it rigorously, I wouldn't be able to predict it. In regard to how many stem cells do we have, I think I'm less concerned, because we have now so many kind of like approaches to get new stem cells into your body. It's not something overall worrying.
Yeah, I would like to actually make a more general comment about that. So absolutely, stem cell, the impact on stem cells is one aspect of this, but as with any experimental medical treatment, there are definitely a variety of different potential side effects that may occur. For example, one thing we know at this point is that the senescence program, so to speak, appears to exist for a good physiological reason, namely that senescent cells are involved in wound healing. This was another of the major discoveries of Judy Campisi's lab. And so it's now pretty much recognized that insofar as Senolytics may be therapeutic, we need to make sure that they are not applied too indiscriminately as in a manner that might, inhibit wound healing. And of course, this goes even beyond senescent cells. So, for example, in the immune system, I mentioned there are these other types of cell that are also in some sense death resistant, but there is still a good deal of controversy and research going on with regard to whether those cells also have positive contributions to, for example, the control of cytomegalovirus, and whether we might have to do some kind of adjunct therapy so as to maintain the protection against cytomegalovirus, even if we remove these death-resistant cells. Part of these considerations are actually part of why we were always so keen on the genetic approach rather than the pharmacological approach to eliminating these cells, because we feel that there's a good deal more scope for precision, for removing exactly the cells we want. And indeed, I think at the moment, the main thing I'm looking at in the whole Senolytics space, whether it's what Unity are doing or other people, is information about the quantification of side effects and the determination of how specific these things can actually be.
That makes sense. Alen, I'd like to get your perspective on this as well. In your conversations with people at Cambridge, is Senolytics something that you're excited about? Is something that you were exposed to early in regards to other life extension therapies, etc. On that topic? Feel free to comment anything.
Yes, sure. I did hear about Senolytics quite early, but I wasn't looking too deep into it until I found this on your website, in fact, lastman.io. And people seem to be quite excited about it. But like it was already mentioned before, precision could be a bit of an issue. And yes, I'm interested to see what results will show from the MMTP.
Excellent. Okay, I think I'm going to take part of that to pivot to another topic. So we've talked about here sort of genetic interventions, perhaps, for Senolytics and precision. So that naturally, I think, would lead one to the conversation of the big thing that everyone's talking about now, CRISPR, and how it may have too much off-target effects, and is it precise enough? What's being done there? So I'm just going to open the floor for anyone who wants to kick that conversation off. Will CRISPR help us cure aging in the near term?
In the near term.
In 5 to 10 years, let's say.
I don't know. I mean, CRISPR to me is again, this is sort of, I don't want to say it's putting the horse before the cart, but I mean, it's a tool, it's a technology, it's a programmable endonuclease. So before you say it's going to cure XYZ, I mean, you have to figure out what do you want to apply it to, right? Is it the right tool? I mean, basically it's, you know, I mean, it's been adapted now, the whole CRISPR system, to do a number of things from its original nuclease activity, such as, reprogramming the epigenome by having things tethered to a dead Cas9, for example. So that certainly gives you flexibility for perhaps, you know, turning on latent Yamanaka factors in a cell. So I can imagine it being used in that sort of application. You know, but then there's, you know, I mean, CRISPR and Cas9 is part of a giant, you know, it's just one piece of a giant puzzle. I mean, if you still have the delivery to worry about, right? How are you going to get this system into the cells that you're concerned about? Is it going to be in vitro? Is it going to be in vivo? Or are you going to use a modified virus? You know, are you going to be able to fit it into the virus? Are you going to be able to target it to the right cells? And then once you get the CRISPR into your cells, if you're talking about modifying the actual genome, well, we still have issues with homologous recombination efficiency. That is like kind of the other, like, third, you know, part of gene therapy that still needs to be addressed, and that's kind of one of the projects I'm working on.
And that would matter with the sort of insertion part.
Yeah,
CRISPR,
if you want to insert things specifically. So, you know, so despite all the hype, CRISPR is a powerful tool, but it's one tool in a giant tool chest. So, you know, I think it's kind of glib to say, or, you know, to even ask the question, like, will CRISPR reverse aging? Just because it's, you know, it's a tool. Maybe it's not the right tool for every application. You know, I mean, so it's really hard for me to say. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's a programmable endonuclease that could be used to cut DNA, and perhaps using, you know, modified versions of Cas9 to also reprogram the epigenome. And if that cures aging, then yes, it will cure aging. But, you know,
just to cover myself, I was being purposefully glib.
I know.
So everybody knows.
Yeah, I know. But it's, you know, you do hear those types of statements, but it is one tool in a whole toolbox of people who are in biotech, and it's certainly going to be useful. It's certainly going to be useful in projects, and it you know, it may be used to reverse aging in a mouse in some fashion that I've mentioned, but, you know, but that being said, like I said, it's just one part of a whole, you know, spectrum of tools. Just by having CRISPR doesn't mean you know how to get it into the cells, especially in vivo, and that requires some sort of, you know, modified virus or some other delivery system, and that has nothing to do with CRISPR. That's a different problem that, you know, that needs to be optimized and solved. And then once the CRISPR is in there, if you want to, like I said, you want to modify the genome, then homologous recombination is another problem that needs to be optimized. That has nothing to do with CRISPR per se. It's just one other kind of, you know, angle that needs to be addressed. So, yeah, it's going to be part of the toolkit, but, you know, how big of a role it's going to play outside of research as far as an actual therapy, I don't know. That's, you know, I don't know. I can speculate, but that's about it.
I want to agree with what Oliver said, but at the same time, I also think it's important to emphasize that CRISPR is, in a way, it's not any old tool, simply because it has become a system that has a huge kind of large number of variations on its theme. The fact that it is so easy and inexpensive to use has allowed a very large number of researchers to play with it. And, you know, in contrast to things that came before, like zinc finger nucleases and so on, it just has turned out that there's an awful lot you can do to make CRISPR different, whether to alter what kinds of things it can do, as Oliver was saying, or also, for that matter, to improve how well it does the things that it can already do. To lower the incidence of off-target effects. Of course, that's a very big issue, and there's been a lot of progress in that area, and there will continue to be. So I think that people are people are entitled to be pretty breathless about CRISPR, to be perfectly honest. It's completely right, of course, that it's only a tool or a family of tools that have to be combined with a whole bunch of other things. But for sure, there's a whole bunch of different types of damage contributing to aging, for which the most realistic repair strategies do involve genetic modifications. And therefore, things like CRISPR are going to be very likely to play essential roles in putting this entire panel together.
Nice. Does that jive with everybody else's sense of things, or anybody have anything else to comment on that?
I have a little comment on that. Is CRISPR really was cool because it trickled down to the public. So it has become so hyped that the public became more aware of genetic modification, and that opens up a new kind of like communication stream with the public. And I think this is definitely a positive thing, and it has brought up the combination of cell and gene therapy as well. And people have become more brave of thinking about it, and that's definitely a positive development.
I think that's a great point, and that's probably one that doesn't get talked about enough. You know, even apparently we're in that business and we're guilty of it right here. Is that I think science in general, but especially longevity biotech or whatever we want to call it, we can do a much better job of sort of engaging people with this research, and that's actually exciting and interesting and has all these great benefits. It's not just this scary quest to defeat death. It's got a lot of positive things, and like you just said, CRISPR, like, for anyone who wants to do some digging on their own, the discovery of CRISPR is super interesting. Like, what was like a bacterial defense system against viruses. We don't have to get into it now, but it's really cool. Well, and
and I'm actually reading a book that was just published. Maybe it's not out yet. I actually found it in the budget. It was an uncorrected proof. It was called what's it called? Not cracking the genome. It was written by Jennifer Doudna and a colleague who's one of the key developers of the technology and probably soon to be Nobel laureate. And she does a really, really good job describing the whole historical background of how it originated. But, it's one thing that gets kind of most people don't talk about because people are enthralled with the technology, as they should be, is just the whole biological repercussions of the system being an actual and acquired immune system for bacteria, which, prior to 2009, most biologists would tell you that, you're nuts if you think that bacteria have an acquired immune system. I mean, we still don't think insects have an acquired immune system, but now maybe we have to start looking for one if bacteria have an acquired immune system, albeit, working at a radically different way that, our acquired immune system works. So that's kind of part of the story that's kind of lost, when we talk about the technology, because there's two really, really impressive things that have come out of the whole CRISPR-Cas9 story. But yeah, just to emphasize what everybody else is saying, especially Aubrey. Yeah, not to downplay it as a tool. Every tool that we accumulate from nature is an important, piece that we have in our freezer that we can then apply to fixing something, right? So once we know something's broken, then of course the other problem is now, well, how do we fix it, right? So the more of these tools that we have in our toolkit, the easier it's going to be to actually then attempt to, repair it. So, so CRISPR is certainly the latest and the greatest in kind of the long line of tools that we've been acquiring steadily from nature and adapting to our own purposes. And I have no doubts that there's going to be more amazing things that we kind of find in the evolutionary toolkit that's already out there that we can then utilize for our own purposes.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's also a good example of, again, just, how fast things are happening. That was 2009 you just mentioned.
Yeah.
It's like it happens so fast that we don't even have time to appreciate how novel it is.
One thing that Jennifer Doudna mentioned in her book is that, it's sort of most people forget that right after zinc finger adenonucleases, people discovered talins, right? This transcription activator like, effectors that recognize single nucleotides. And then that was now the greatest thing. And then sort of the thunder was stolen by the discovery of CRISPR, like just a few years later before anybody got a chance to really optimize talins. So things have been, being discovered and then, co-opted by biotechnologists in a pretty, really fast, I think that's what's gotten to me is how fast people have been adapting the discoveries to applications in the laboratory. To me, that's pretty cool. And of course, it all kind of started way back in the 70s with discoveries restriction endonucleases. But anyway, that's for another historical discussion.
You're giving everyone homework assignments.
Yes, look that all up.
We actually have a couple of questions coming in from the audience, so I want to kick those in here. I think this one is probably to Aubrey to start. Al Yarin, I think, asks, Short telomeres are correlated with mitochondrial dysfunction and damage to the nuclear lamins, which would increase mutation rate. Does oncosense have a counter to this?
Yes. Okay. So short telomeres are generally bad for cells. When cells get short telomeres, they recognize the ends of chromosomes as damaged chromosomes. The most extreme overt example of this is that cells will sometimes end up joining chromosomes together end to end because the end of the chromosomes will be interpreted, will be mistakenly identified as broken chromosomes. But there are subtler effects than that happen when the telomeres get short. And yes, in the cell, everything is connected to everything else. So it never surprises me when I hear some new discovery of some other, bad thing that's going on in cells that have short telomeres. Now, of course, this general family of observations is the main reason why some people in the field of the biology of aging have become rather keen on the idea of extending telomeres as a way of protecting and maintaining youthful phenotype within cells of all types. But of course, it is also very well understood that the overwhelming majority, anyway, of large mammals use limitations on the length of telomeres as an anti-cancer defense. Of course, there's no 100% ironclad proof of that, but certainly nobody else has come up with any good hypothesis for why there is such a very tight control over the expression of telomerase in cells in large mammals, whereas conversely people do understand that the very much more promiscuous expression of telomerase in small mammals like mice is kind of no surprise, because the fact is a small mammal can be killed by a small tumor, and tumors can get that big without having to do anything with their telomeres. So control of telomerase would not actually be effective in a small mammal as an anti-cancer therapy. So coming back to oncosense, to what I often call WILT, the whole body interdiction of lengthening of telomeres. Here, of course, the goal is to make it even harder for a cancer cell to turn on any kind of telomere elongation mechanism than it naturally is. It's already very hard, but we want to make it even harder by disrupting the genes that are responsible for these enzymes like telomerase. And that's we've recognized since the beginning, since I first started putting this idea forward 15 years ago, that this would have side effects. The side effects include the things that the questioner was mentioning, and they also include much more overt things. Simply, for example, the depletion of the stem cell pools in rapidly renewing tissues, such as the blood or the lining of the gut or whatever. And so I've always been absolutely straight and honest about this, that I hope to heaven that we will never actually need to implement WILT, that we will come up with some other approach to really, really, really controlling cancer that is just as good. And of course, in the past 5 years or so, the progress that has been made in cancer immunotherapy has given a significant amount of cause for optimism. Of course, there's a hugely long way to go. There are many areas, many types of tumor in which we have not yet seen significant advances in cancer immunotherapy, but the rate of progress has been very, very many times faster than it was in the previous 20 years. So one's got to be reasonably optimistic there. If that doesn't work out, however, then fact is we need something else. And even though WILT is an extremely elaborate and ambitious approach, it's the only other idea out there that has much of a chance of really being good enough to keep cancer under the same level of control that we would need if we fix all the other types of damage that the body accumulates, that the other 6 strands of sense discuss. And as for the way that we might address these side effects of controlling telomere length, we've put some work into this, of course. We recognize that the only real way to address this problem is to replace cells that have got into trouble and probably died as a result of their telomeres getting critically short And of course, the paradigm of this is bone marrow transplants as a way of replenishing the population of hematopoietic stem cells and thereby maintaining the immortality of the stem cell pool, even though there is no individual cell that's immortal anymore. We recognize that this is something that we would need to do in a variety of different tissues, certainly in the lining of the gut and also in the skin and probably also in the lung. And the results that we've been able to obtain so far have been reasonably promising. We funded a project in China a few years ago, which showed very convincingly that the blood stem cell population can be replenished using stem cells that do not have a gene for telomerase anymore, and yet if those cells are initially equipped with nice long telomeres, then the therapy works perfectly well to replace cells that are dying off because they have short telomeres. We also funded for a few years a project at Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine, trying to do the same thing in the gut on the basis of some very exciting work that the group we funded had done, identifying certain factors which would allow cells to be, will allow the population of stem cells in the gut lining to be repopulated from the pool of circulating mesenchymal stem cells or endothelial progenitor cells. That work is still at a very early stage, but it's going reasonably well. So yes, all in all, my feeling is that we need to continue to pursue this approach until such time as, if we're lucky, other therapies, in particular, I think most promisingly cancer immunotherapy, comes along in a manner that is sufficiently powerful to actually view cancer as a solved problem. And I'm not holding my breath for that.
Nice. I think that's a really good topic for kind of a follow-up opinion question, being as by your own admission, wilt is a pretty extreme tactic. So I want to pose a scenario here. So if you had a scenario where you could take a therapy like wilt, like right now, that would just essentially just knock out telomerase, and then you wouldn't have the cancer problem, but you would need periodic, say, stem cell infusions to survive, once every 7 years or whatever. Steve was joking with me about, who would be the first to bring up a pop culture reference. So I'll be that person right now. So it reminds me, this is obviously, again, an extreme scenario that probably won't come to pass. But, there's an issue there. And it reminds me of the video game Deus Ex, where there was an anti-rejection drug that people needed to take to, because they had like implantations, and because everyone relied on this and they needed it constantly, it allowed the company to sort of blackmail everybody, and everyone was in a bad position. So given that scenario, like if wilt was available and it was the only way to stop cancer, would you guys take it? Would you go for that?
I think it has to be recognized that there's a bunch of different variations on that theme. For example, there would be nothing to stop somebody from taking a stem cell therapy that temporarily reversed wilt. In other words, that where the stem cells did have telomerase genes still, so that they would be immortal after all. And this would restore the susceptibility to cancer, but it would also restore the independence from this regular treatment. That's the kind of thing one has to think about if one's really worried about these things.
Yeah, I agree. It's just worth noting that in that scenario, you are sort of, if, both the wilt producing company and the, restarting your telomerase company, or, the technology gets lost or something, now you're dependent is basically the situation that I was raising. Right, in that sense, it creates an interesting dependency scenario.
Our clock is ticking anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. It's a fair counter. Again, I think it's an interesting thought experiment that, again, I don't think we're ever going to have to encounter in that form. Just, I don't know. But it's worth, would you, if that was the only way, if you were in potentially danger of cancer, would you undergo a therapy that just knocked out telomerase just for a little while to try to keep you at bay from cancer, or would that be too frightening to you?
Well, I mean, it would depend at what stage I was at, right? I mean, it all depends. It depends on the circumstance, depends on my frame of mind at the moment. It's hard for me to answer right now, okay. Right?
Admittedly, it was a contrived question.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, and of course, it's so dependent on ongoing advances. I'm reminded a little bit of the situation with cryonics, where one has to make a choice between signing up for whole body or for neuro. Of course, there are financial considerations, but there are also very profound technical considerations with regard to the quality of cryopreservation. And these considerations change all the time, as a result of advances. So one constantly needs to revisit these questions.
So now you bring up cryopreservation. So that's an interesting sort of potential, buying us time scenario. Now, as you mentioned, maybe it's not quite there yet, but however long it takes us to, figure out the underlying causes of aging, it's an open question whether we'll figure out reliable cryoprotection before that, maybe. But one thing that I thought was interesting, and Aubrey, maybe you've talked to Max more, I don't know, but one thing that I would consider, like, I would be scared personally about putting myself under for like 50 years or whatever, like, what if the company goes out of business? What if the world ends, right?
And you wake up.
But, or but one thing that I think you could get a lot more buy-in from the public on maybe is sort of like a yearly plan or something like that. Like, yeah, let me come out for like 1 week every year. Like, how are we doing? Is aging solved? No? Okay, well, put me back in. Like a cyclical plan. Is this something Max Moore has considered? Does anybody know anything about that?
Well, I don't know whether there's been serious consideration on that, but I will certainly tell you my immediate take on it, which is that if we get to a point at which the revival of someone who has been cryopreserved is really routine, it's really safe and so on, then the question one is really asking is, would one choose to undergo some kind of elective recryopreservation on the basis of particular circumstances? Now, the circumstance that you just described kind of doesn't make sense because, of course, at the moment, people are cryopreserved only when they're really, really not very well. So not very well that they have been pronounced legally dead. And therefore, you're probably not going to want to try to revive such a person until you have made, really decisive progress in bringing people back from the brink. Let's remember that a sense, which looks certainly to me like the most realistic approach to medically eliminating aging, is really a preventative therapy. It's going to be most effective and most practical for people who are not even yet sick, let alone so sick that they have been pronounced legally dead. Now, of course, as time goes on, we're going to be able to push that forward. We'll be able to combine these rejuvenation therapies with other therapies that more directly attack the actual ill health of late life that results from this damage, and that process will continue. And I certainly envisage, the way I think about the arrival of practical revival from cryonics is when we have incrementally moved that needle forward so far that people, even so sick as to have been pronounced legally dead, are going to be practical, candidates for rejuvenation. So your question kind of answers itself in that sense.
Yeah, I was sort of presupposing like perfect cryopreservation and resuscitation in that. And again, to drop a pop culture reference, that's kind of what Lestat did in the Anne Rice books in vampire form. He would, go into his vampire coffin, pop out every century. How are things looking? It's boring. I'll go back in.
I think, not to put too much of a jokey spin on it, I think once we get cryopreservation like optimized, I think combining that with compound interest would be a great way to become rich.
You're always thinking. He's always got the scheming. Okay, so we actually have a couple more questions from the audience, and I'm going to combine a few because they're related. This, again, might start off with Aubrey responding. So basically, it will be with SENS therapies or any therapies, what percentage of them do you think we'll need to have to redo on a consistent basis, and which, how much of them are going to be one-offs? And as sort of a corollary to that, and this is more of an open question to everyone, say we solve all these problems and we can live to 150 years old. Do we think anything new potentially is going to pop up, some new limiting factor that wasn't revealed because we were dying at 100, or do we think we got everything already?
Yeah, I'm going to answer those two questions separately because I don't think they are actually all that closely related. First question about whether things will be one-offs or repeated therapies. Some of the things kind of, at first sight, they look like they'll be one-offs, and some of them look more like they'll be repeated. But in practice, I think they're all going to end up being repeated simply because they won't be perfect. They will be, therapies that hit maybe, 80% of your senescent cells or 80% of your mitochondria, and we improve the details of the therapies in a manner that allows the therapies to be reapplied in a more more effective and more comprehensive manner. This is really the underlying basis for the concept of longevity escape velocity that I've talked about all this time. So kind of from the point of view of the recipient, these things are all going to be repeat therapies. The only real difference is whether the therapy will actually be better than the previous time. So it really doesn't make much difference. With regard to whether there's likely to be an eighth deadly thing and a ninth one and so on, this is something that, of course, I have thought about since the beginning of time. And as time goes on, I've become increasingly optimistic that we're not really going to see these things simply because we haven't seen them yet. I often point out that it's been well over 30 years since we identified a new underlying type of damage that the body accumulates, and it's been at least 15 years since I've been challenging my colleagues to come up with them, and I seem to be getting away with it. So this is kind of good news. But at the same time, I know that it would be a very bad idea to be complacent about this. So I think, and this is something that I suggested a long time ago, which actually my suggestion probably cost me the opportunity to be hired by the University of Cambridge to do gerontology, which may have been a blessing in disguise. But I suggested in my job seminar at Cambridge that that once we get all of this going, the apprehension of the arrival of new things will drive us to start doing a lot more non-human primate research to essentially reverse the trend that has existed over the past few decades in reducing the amount of non-human primate research. Because, of course, non-human primates, genetically very similar to us, get, rather the same kinds of pathologies. If we have a large collection of a large number of such species and we, give them the same therapies that we're giving ourselves, the fact that they age twice as fast as us, plus or minus, is kind of a good thing, because it means that anything that we're likely to suffer from later as a result of having fixed all the early things is probably going to emerge in at least some of these species in a manner that we will be able to be aware of and characterize and research and develop fixes for before those fixes are actually needed by us.
Great. Well, I certainly hope you're correct about no new things popping up, but I guess time will tell. I also wanted to shout out the people who had asked those questions. It was Sebastian Pai and Akshith, I believe. So there was some discussion right there of sort of the length of trials and how different animal models are useful because they're shorter lived. Alen, I believe you had a question about longevity trial lengths, I believe. I have in my notes that you do.
Longevity trial lengths.
Biomarkers, etc.
Oh, yes, that is right. It seems that the human trials for anti-aging therapies must take a really long time to perform because it is late aging that we're talking about, and we all age ourselves. So how much do we currently know about aging biomarkers? And is there any hope that it'll be possible to speed up the process anytime soon?
All right, I'll have a go at that, but other people should have a go as well. So there's two basic answers to your question that combine to form good news. The first answer is that therapies that postpone the ill health of old age are not necessarily restricted to really long clinical trials. If you have a therapy that slows down the accumulation of damage in the body, then you know that it's going to be most effective if you start early, because you don't have much damage yet. And those, of course, certainly would take a long time to measure the difference in time before things start going downhill physiologically. But if conversely you have therapies which are actually repairing damage, which is, of course, what sense is all about, then that doesn't really apply anymore. You can actually take people who are on the brink of getting sick, or perhaps even are getting sick, and you can apply these things, and you might expect to see bona fide health indicators, just not even at the level of what we would call biomarkers of aging, but just, phenotypes that we would call the early stages of specific diseases that would actually genuinely diverge as a result of the therapies pretty quickly, just because of spontaneous recovery as a result of the damage being eliminated. That wouldn't necessarily be true all the time, but if it's true at all, that's still good news. However, to answer your biomarkers question more directly, of course, there has been a great deal of work in the attempt to identify bona fide biomarkers of aging. It's been spectacularly unsuccessful over the years, and I believe that's really for two reasons. Number one, because aging is such a multifaceted thing that you need to, you need the kind of highly sophisticated big data based approaches that have only recently become feasible. And the other reason is actually kind of related. The fact that aging is so multifaceted has meant that it's actually quite hard to define what you mean by a biomarker of aging in the first place. If it means anything to do with getting sick, then you have different biomarkers for different ways of getting sick. And, it's all a little bit circular. And so I feel that, maybe that was a misguided quest in the first place. However, there's a good thing about that, which is that there's a different kind of biomarker of aging that is much more reliable than anything directly health related, like, your blood pressure or whatever, which is simply what you can do. There's this concept called the activities of daily living, things like, can you bathe yourself and can you do your own shopping and stuff like that, that people have been studying for a long time. And over the past decade especially, there's been quite a lot of really very persuasive demonstrations that the decline in one's ability to do stuff, even though different people lose different activities of daily living in a different order, nevertheless, the sheer number that you lose out of a large, maybe a few dozen different ones, is actually a massively good predictor of how long you're going to live. So there may actually be fairly near-term assayable, measurable impacts of these therapies, even if we don't rely on what I was saying earlier about rejuvenation.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Speaking of which,
yeah, I want to jump in on Aubrey's last point. There is, especially now in the past couple of years, with the advent or the improvement of things like machine learning and deep neural networks, et cetera, it's probably becoming more plausible to develop classifiers for this sort of like physiometric aging. Like watching videos of people and analyzing their gait and how they move and things like that, and getting a reliable sort of sense of their physical age related to their chronological age. And as a little bit of a call ahead plug, two campaigns that we're considering launching in the near future are going to have to do with exactly this. One of them with more like lung capacity and that sort of thing, and one of them that's more image based. So I think this is an exciting way, because the nice thing about machine learning like this is, Aubrey, you famously show that metabolism graph that's just a complete mess, and you're like, who's going to understand this, right? So in some sense that is aging. It's very complicated. So when you use machine learning to classify things, like, for example, if I feed it a bunch of images of flowers and I want to get a classifier of, is this a rose or is this a tulip? The nice thing about these machine learning algorithms is that you don't really need to understand how. You just feed it enough data, and over time it just goes, yeah, that's a rose, that's a tulip. So in a sense,
but also that massive metabolic spaghetti mess that you see there basically gets distilled down into gee, it's harder for me to get my butt up out of the bed in the morning. If it's not working at optimal efficiency, and that simple metric can be measured by a tablet-based, system.
And then if you can apply that metric to studies in progress, if you were able to reliably analyze a model organism and go, this is how its physical age is related to its chronological age based on this intervention, now you're starting to get earlier results. You don't have to wait 3 years until the mice die or whatever to know if you're having a potential longevity.
It's kind of funny. I mean, it's almost like, if you think of, the actual worm studies of aging, right? I mean, all of those lifespan curves basically comes down to its response to a poke from a stick, right? Is it still going to move if I poke it with a stick? No, well, it's not doing so well, right? So I mean, that's basically those curves are.
With C. elegans, right?
C. elegans, yeah.
Guys, I don't know what the timing is for this session, but I'm afraid I only have another 10 minutes. I need to leave in 10 minutes.
Okay, sure. So I think, we have another hour, actually. I'm not sure if we're going to soak that up, but after this will be more of like an advocacy part. So I think right now then would be a good point to ask Steve, do we have any specific scientific questions that came in from the Facebook chat that maybe, would be directed to Aubrey so we can get him to respond before he has to leave? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
I appear to have lost my Zoom off the bottom. Do you still see me?
Yep.
Yes.
Heavens for that. I can't seem to be able to get back onto Zoom. It's disappeared. Yeah, we've had a few things. I can put them in the chat if you'd like.
Sure, or read them out. Whatever, pick two that you think would be good to respond to.
A lot of people thanking us for doing this. Apparently our audio is very good. That's always nice to hear.
Nice.
We've got one here. What's the optimal anti-aging diet? State of the art. Paleo, ketogenic, zero carb. Is there a particular type of diet? I mean, my friend Mike Lustgarden would say no.
Kind of a little bit of a smile. The diet which makes you most happy and less stress is probably the best one for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the answer I usually give to this question is that people differ from each other so much that any generalization that you might read in some book is almost certain to be wrong. And the only real thing you can do is listen to your body and, determine what works. And absolutely, what works, a large component of that is what works mentally, because there's so much impact of stress on the rate of aging.
Great. You have one other question maybe you can ask, Steve?
Yeah, bear with. Okay. Just having a look.
That being said, you might want to lay off the White Castle burgers and maybe put a little bit more greens and lean meats into your diet. And fruits.
I'm a Taco Bell man myself. No, just kidding.
Taco Bell. Was it?
I believe there was an interesting question about Yale. Do you think you could read it, Steve?
Yeah.
And whereabouts is this? Because I'm looking at the Facebook feed, Elena.
Elena, just repeat the question from memory to the best of your ability.
Okay, I could chime in here while Steve's looking for something else. I think it was basically just, is there a status report from the work of, I believe, glucosapine breaking?
Okay, yeah, I can spend a couple of minutes on that. So yes, absolutely there is. So the last published information on that, I'm sure this is the reason for the question, was 18 months ago when we had this very important breakthrough paper in Science magazine showing that we could now synthesize glucosapine in a test tube, which means that we can now make grams of the stuff for almost no money, in contrast to the previous situation where the only way to isolate it was to break down old collagen, basically. And doing that, it's extremely laborious and expensive, and it only gives trace quantities of the stuff. This is enormously important as an enabling breakthrough, because what it allows is for us to do all the obvious things that require a certain amount of material, such as raising antibodies to the stuff or identifying bacteria that can break it down, things like that. And so what's been happening over the past 18 months is precisely that. The group at Yale have been banging away really well on this. We've been able to continue funding them. And actually, David Spiegel, the professor from Yale, was actually visiting the Bay Area just yesterday, so we had a good update. The short story is that on the antibody side, that's been done. There's now a good antibody, and actually with some funding that we recently received from one of the founders of Oculus, we were able to supplement the funding of that group to the extent of being able to create a monoclonal antibody. That's very important for scaling, because it means that you can create, because it's molecularly precise and identified, it means you can make as much of it as you like. And of course, that's very important for determining how well something is working. If you have a drug, for example, or an enzyme that's supposed to break this stuff down, you want to be able to measure the result, and antibodies are the way to do that. And in terms of actually finding things to break it down, we're mainly focused right now on the enzymatic approach, identifying bacterial enzymes that are able to do this. And that whole way of doing things has evolved quite a lot from the situation we were in more than 10 years ago, when we were applying this approach to atherosclerosis and macular degeneration. Of course, when we did that, we had some good successes, and the result has been now those projects spinning out into companies, including ICOR, which is run by Kelsey Moody, that works on our macular degeneration work. But now how this is done is a little bit more sophisticated. Rather than just getting soil samples from them from all over the world and just sifting them essentially and finding bacteria that can do this or that, what you do instead is you identify DNA from the environment. You don't even need to know what species the DNA came from. And you essentially insert random chunks of DNA into regular culturable bacteria like E. coli, modified in such a way that they need this particular function in order to survive. So, for example, you break some pathway that the bacteria naturally have that would synthesize some particular amino acid. And long and short of it is that's also going very well. The results are a bit preliminary still. I don't want to say too much because, you know, that's the nature of science. We really want to be sure. But we're very excited right now at the rate that this is going, and, you know, totally watch this space. We will be publicizing things in our newsletter, of course, and on the website as soon as we possibly can, as soon as things get to a point where we're really sure that the progress is real.
Excellent. Very encouraging. So the last thing I want to do before you have to peel off, Aubrey, is I just want to shift the conversation to kind of a different tack of more about, so we've been talking kind of hard research, hard science now. I want to move it a little bit more towards, you know, the bottlenecks of getting more funding, getting the word out. So to that point, Aubrey, you can start us off, and then, you know, right before you leave, you can, you know, plug whatever you want regarding the SENS. But the question that we have here, Sean Roy and many others have asked, why can't researchers rely on state funding to tackle this problem? And why does it look like, at least, governments aren't really interested in doing anything about this, given that it's such a real problem with population demographics that should be known?
Yeah, there's a whole network of reasons why it's difficult to get funding for this kind of research, either from government or, for that matter, from the private sector. But I believe that the single most profound underlying reason is pure psychology. People are just so terrified of aging that their only way of putting it out of their minds and getting on with their miserably short lives is to pretend that aging is actually some kind of blessing in disguise, and or that it's actually just a kind of law of nature and there's never anything that can be done about it. This, to my mind, is the basis for the extraordinary persistence of this utter fiction that there are some aspects of aging which are diseases and can be cured, and some aspects that aren't, and are, in some sense, aging itself, which has no biological basis whatsoever, but yet is extremely entrenched in society. And so, you know, I think the only way that we can fix this, we can improve the situation, is to do two things. Number one, to actually make whatever progress we can incrementally in the lab. Every little bit of progress that's made makes a difference, you know, in terms of the perceived feasibility and plausibility of all of this. And secondly, just to keep the conversation going, to keep, you know, pointing out how embarrassingly infantile the objections to this work are, and to you know, to raise the quality of the debate all the time, to give good answers again and again, however often those answers are ignored, to all the questions that people have, all the concerns that people have, and just to raise the credibility. And of course, the more this work, and that also is a bootstrapping, you know, positive feedback thing. Every time that somebody with a lot of credibility comes into the field, you know, we mentioned Craig Venter earlier on, you know, equally Google, of course, it kind of doesn't matter whether those people actually make important scientific contributions. They are making a huge contribution just by attaching their name to this crusade.
Absolutely. Now, is there, you know, before you have to go, is there anything in particular that you'd like to, you know, implore the audience to help out with, whether financially or, you know, boots on the ground?
Yeah, let me do that. Yeah. Just take 1 minute on that. So Sense Research Foundation, of course, is a non-profit, and we are funded overwhelmingly by philanthropy. But as I've mentioned, and as most of the audience probably know, many of our projects have now been spun out into private startup companies, and also, of course, there are other companies working in very, very closely related to us in the same space that we work closely with. So from the point of view of someone who is interested in supporting this work financially, there is a huge temptation just to go and, you know, invest in these companies and to leave the foundation alone. That is a huge mistake that we constantly have to highlight, because the reason the foundation still exists and we have not just declared victory and closed ourselves down is because there are still a number of absolutely vital projects which have not yet reached the point of investability, and therefore which continue to need to be funded in this way. And of course, from the point of view of an investor, it makes sense to do both, because if you give us significant amounts of money as a philanthropic gesture, then what you do is you get access. You get all the information, because we tend to be very nice to you and have you, come along to our lab and hear what we're doing and all that. You get information that will allow you to be the first investor, the lead investor in some new spin-out when it's ready. In fact, that was exactly what happened with our very first spin-out, the one that's focused on our atherosclerosis work. It was a company created by a guy who had been giving us proper money for the previous 5 years or so, and he decided that this project was far enough along to be worth taking private, so he did. And that is exactly the kind of thing that could happen again and again. So we think that the critical thing to get out there, the critical message to get out there, is that the foundation and other nonprofits, for that matter, not just us, but mainly us, we act as the engine room of this industry. Our goal has always been to create an industry, and we are certainly doing so, but there's a long way to go, and we definitely need the engine room to continue to be funded well. All right then, guys, I've got to run. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the call.
Thank you very much for joining us, Aubrey.
Thanks, Aubrey.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So
I was gonna say that this isn't funding and finance is something I just don't understand. I don't think it's inherent in aging, and I've made this analogy before. It's like, I mean, the economy that we live in is such that like values the leading company of the CRISPR technology at like what, $65 million, and a company that makes an app that allows you to take temporary images of your crotch and send them to your friend and they disappear. Snapchat is valued at over $3 billion. So I don't even know how those numbers work, but that's just the world we live in.
I think Aubrey is absolutely correct, as far as with aging in particular. The basically it boils down to not even wanting to get your hopes up until something is actually real. But to your point, I think the thing that affects every industry is really just a lack of long-term thinking. And
it's long-term.
I don't think I'm being novel by saying that at all.
Apps are easy to make, and they make investors that are coming in early lots of money. So that's why you can have an ephemeral app, worth more than the gross national product of some Western European country.
So since we're kind of turning it to more like advocacy and this kind of talk, I want to piggyback of what Oliver said to raise something interesting and hear what everyone thinks about that. So one thing that I think is particularly interesting is that if you look like throughout history, there was much more of a sense of long-term thinking in like ancient days, where people would work on a church that would take 300 years or something like that, knowing that, because I believe that the difference there is that there was a sense of sort of the eternal, the sublime of really persisting beyond your small existence. And in some ways, I think modern society might sort of make you not feel that everything's hurried in the moment. So in a weird sort of positive way, I think one that might work against getting funding for this reason, it's hard to plan for the long term when everyone just wants what's happening now. But as an optimistic view, I think that as we do start to see gains in lifespan, which I think is inevitable based on the current, it's done so in the past, barring some sort of nuclear catastrophe, we should continue in that direction. If people live longer, 150 years, 200 years, maybe people will be a little bit more mindful about long-term effects, on the environment or et cetera, because they're going to be around for longer as well. So maybe in a sense, we can recover that sense of long-term thinking. That's very philosophical. So feel free to branch off of anything I said there. Or
I'm just going to say maybe, but it's hard to predict how society on the whole actually works. The only thing we have to work with is the actual data that's out there, and and just see if we can wring any kind of extrapolation out of that. One example being, to counter arguments that people make about population explosions. The data suggests the opposite. I argue that once we have the aging problem solved, we'll probably go extinct based on I know I'm being very bleak here, but we tend to push off procreation, right? I mean that's what you see when
you're just calling yourself. It's okay.
Yeah. So I'm just saying population explosion won't be a problem. But as far as
if anything, underpopulation, problem, maybe.
But maybe that's a selling point for some people. But so philosophically, I'm going to back away from this because I don't it's
too speculative.
It's hard for me to predict based on how society's going to.
I see Elena has her hand up, so by all means, jump in.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't agree with you regarding the short-term thinking or long-term thinking problem, because, actually, the population aging was first recognized as a problem back in 1968, if I'm not mistaken. It was brought to the public attention by Malta government. And since then, we had quite a lot of work regarding how to help our society to adapt to these things. So probably the issue we're dealing with right now is not exactly the absence of long-term thinking. It's rather how our public is informed about the opportunities that we have now, that we see emerging. Because right now, I couldn't say that people are properly informed about the promise of rejuvenation technologies. And this is actually our duty and our responsibility as advocates to bring this to public attention, to make them understand that actually the conditions are changing and changing pretty fast. Almost every year you get new information, new data, new projects, new openings, new findings, and something keep changing all the time, just a few years ago, we didn't know the word Senolytics because there were no Senolytics. And now there is a new type of drugs, and these drugs have already extended mice lifespan to 1/3, I believe, by 1/3. And now we see them being tested in clinical trials by Unity Biotechnology. So really, things are changing very fast, and I believe that people just don't cope with this huge speed that we witness being the insiders of this community. So once again, if we seek to increase public support for research on aging, especially fundamental research, which is obviously not getting enough funding right now, then we should try to become more like, successful teachers or something like this. And I wouldn't say that we are right now.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And yeah, I'm sure the answer is it's a confluence of many things, all synergizing. But something Aubrey said was interesting. So I want to pivot the conversation based on that. So he had mentioned that, once something is there, once we have the pill that you can take and it makes you live 10 years younger, reverse aging by 10 years, and there's no side effects, and everyone, it's out there in the market, that the conversation will likely change very quickly. Do we think that is true? Like, how much do you think it matters that, just focus everything on the research and get something that works? Is that the path that we should go forward? Or is it really important also to bring the public along at every step of the way and make sure they're informed? How important do we think that is, and why?
Certainly having some working technology will help us a lot, because one of the issues, one of the concerns that people have is that these technologies are not going to work well. Well, as you probably know, it's been shown by several studies that one of the biggest concerns people have, that this is unhealthy period of life that's going to be extended. So once we actually can prove that we're going to extend healthy and productive life, that will probably make the whole idea of life extension much more appealing to the general public.
Right. I'm gonna be, again, be a bit cynical here. But I mean, just the way humans operate, you really want everybody to be like, talking about this and being on board with this. Come up with a technology that tomorrow, that basically takes a 90-year-old person and now they're suddenly 40, and then tell the world, you can't have it. It's just for us. And I guarantee you, everybody's going to be talking about it, and it's going to get well-versed on the technology, and it's going to get on the bandwagon. That's just how it works.
It's like negative psychology. Well,
no, that's how it works. It's like, hey, I got this wonder drug that makes me smart. You can't have it.
Well, if you think,
problem solved, everybody's on board.
If you think about it, though, it's interesting. What I think is potentially, not to say we should architect that, but what's valid about that thought process is, in a sense, income inequality is a very hot topic now, and this could, in a sense, be like the ultimate income inequality, right? So if people are really upset about getting, less of a share of a pie, how would they feel about you know, if the poor are dying and the rich are living, that's a huge, people would be really caring about that.
Only time people debate about that is if they're emotionally invested in something or pissed off, right? So anytime that, you know, it's just basic primate psychology, right? Like, you know, monkey A gets more piece of the pie than monkey B, right? And monkey B goes crazy, right? Even though they're both satisfied. I mean, it's just the way it works.
Well, let's hope we can all work together to bring the technology to everyone simultaneously, so we don't have to go monkey crazy. But
well, you know, one funny thing is that right now, one of the best ways to extend life is actually not to spoil your own health by insufficient amounts of physical activity, by poor diet, by something else, by social interaction, wrong social interaction, I mean, violence and all. These are actually things that anyone could afford, right? Anyone could do some calorie restriction or some physical activity, even it's just in his room, some small workouts, you know. But anyways, people are going to complain that someone else is getting more. Well, probably it will be great to start right now with doing these exact things that are already proved to be useful for healthy life extension. And only after you are doing this, you probably will be more in a position to complain about someone else getting some super treatment.
Yeah. Now, devil's advocate here to kind of you know, sort of, I guess, turn things a bit negative on ourselves. You know, all this preaching that we're doing, that this technology is real, that it's coming, and so on and so forth. I've had more than one person come up to me, you know, in various environments where, you know, I interact people outside of science and saying, it's like, you know, that's great. I'm just going to keep smoking the way I'm smoking right now and treat myself like a piece of garbage because you guys will fix it later. And I'm like,
well, that's true of anything, you know, cancer.
You know, so it's sort of had the reverse effect when I explain the technology. They're like, great, all the more reason for me not to go to the gym. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, I've encountered people like that before. You know, they say, oh, great, yeah, I can drink, smoke, you know, take cocaine and all sorts of things, and you guys will totally fix it. And we're like, well, we might
wait until we're there first.
Yeah, well,
that's what I say. Yeah,
I tell them that too. I'm like, you have to get to a certain certain minimal level of health for it to be somewhat effective, right? I mean, you can't be already like at death's door and expect maximal benefit. But you know, again, it's sort of the message gets lost.
Yeah. And I'd like to get Alexandra's opinion as, you know, someone who's on the bench here. You know, are you just like, screw everything else, just the research matters, or do you think of it more, it really has to be the public as well?
No, I think the public has to be on board because we have done this just working on our bench, and we have not come very far. We haven't got the funding, we haven't got the support, we don't even get the students being interested. So not even the students which are really public, but kind of like the upcoming new scientists. So even they are not in kind of like excited by aging. So no, we definitely have to get everyone on board because otherwise we will be very, very slow. And there's, I think, also potential out there because we have seen with different communities kind of like engaging with science and helping scientists. So there's huge potential out there which we would want to get engaged and kind of like be like they're hobby scientists, and I think software can really help with that. There have been examples of that out there, like you identify a cancer cell and thereby help pathologists kind of like recognizing cancer. So if we could have like fun bits like this, like make aging research fun and interesting, I think that would be really helping the public getting engaged. But I wouldn't have an idea of like how to do it, but definitely kind of like if that would exist, I think more people would be engaging with us and get excited and maybe fund us, because games and entertainment always works and people always have a buck free for that. So we just have to find a way of making aging research a game, maybe.
I think that's a great idea. And to visit the earlier conversation again, the idea of biomarkers, I think, is maybe a perfect area there, because you can sort of crowdsource a community training of a machine learning algorithm. that could do this. So I think that's like folded is kind of what you were talking about as well. That was like a game that people folding proteins and all that. That was cool. Alen, I'd like to get your opinion just on this sort of, on the ground sense of things of how much you think advocacy and getting the word out is important, or is it only the research that matters?
Sure. I do think that advocacy is very important for this, partly because it's a very complex problem, and we do need, I do believe we do need more people to be working on this, as well as more funding. Without in public interest, there's not going to be much funding, and without funding, it's difficult to progress at a steady rate. That is part of the issue. Another part of the issue is even if something useful is released, who knows how the public will react to it without any prior knowledge about the product and without prior thinking about the problem. What if it's a very negative reaction? What if the product is banned from a country, for example? Right. That wouldn't be very beneficial to the field.
At least not to that country.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Like in the talk that I had given in the Netherlands, I actually brought up a couple of cases of exactly that, of the stem cell ban being the classic example. That there is a risk of potentially catastrophic political pushback, where if something happens and someone says, no, we're not doing that, boom, and just shuts everything down. So I think educating the public, kind of having a grassroots movement is super important, one, for that reason. And to your other point, funding, yeah.
It's complex.
Yeah.
I was going to say that this, you could take the stem cell thing one way or the other, right? I mean, there was backlash against Bush, and that sort of galvanized state governments.
Well, here's one point, is that I remember back when I drove, I live in New York City now and don't have a car anymore after Hurricane Sandy destroyed it. But back when I used to commute from Long Island into the city, all over the place, I used to listen to a lot of C-SPAN, on the floor of Congress. And I remember the debates when they were talking about the stem cell ban, and the things that the congressmen, and they weren't pandering for the TV. This was on the floor, of the House and Senate. The stuff that they were saying was so misinformed. It was ridiculous. They thought that an embryonic stem cell was like, growing a baby in a vat and like ripping its heart out, and like whoa, and that's from that point they were basing their discussion on what the policy should be.
Yeah,
so
I know, but congressmen are stupid in general. I mean, not just stem cells, right? There was that one congressman who voted to cut off funding for some artificial intelligence robot just because the robot gave a demonstration of,
of murdering someone.
No. Well, then they would have gotten funded, but it was able to fold it. Like, you would throw like a random towel and it would fold it perfectly. He's like, what, we need more towel folding robots? Like, he just didn't understand, like,
it was a representation
the sophisticated mathematics that had to be involved in folding a towel. It's like, don't we have maids for that? He's like, I'm like, no, man, that's
all
not.
Right. Let's not get too political or demonize all Congress people, because I'm sure there's some smart Congress people out there.
Are there?
Somewhere.
I went to college, Keith. What are you saying?
Maybe one day all of us can run for office in our respective countries, and we'll do it on the ground. But to this point again of sort of grassroots building, obviously I and we believe in this, otherwise we wouldn't be doing what we're doing with Lifespan.io and Leaf Science. So one thing that I think is also important and is a potentially charged topic, so I'm interested in your comments, and also if anyone's commenting in Facebook, Steve. One thing I think is super important as we're kind of cresting the wave here of being on the radar, of being on the news anytime there's a trial to potentially reverse aging, it's really getting out there. People understand that something is happening. And I personally think it's very important to capture the narrative there and make sure we position it in the right way, because not to demonize any side of things, certain aspects of transhumanism, we're all ostensibly transhumanist in some way, but like certain things, a lot of times, often things can be put in the same bucket. You can have talking about, nicotinamide potentially extending lifespan, in a trial in Harvard, being talked about in the same sentence as like, putting your brain into a computer or something like that. And now, while they might be both interesting, they are apples and oranges as far as like current feasibility and desirability. So I think it's important that we do, not just us, but organizations like us, play a role of a middleman there to put things into context and to also help position things in ways that people can really get behind. Like, you know, if you say someone, hey, you want to live to be 200 years old, someone might have legitimate reasons for saying no, or, you know, they just don't feel like they need to live that long. But if you say, hey, you know, do you want your mom to have Alzheimer's disease? Most people would say, hell no. So I think, you know, it's a no-brainer that there are successful ways to position this while still being authentic, without having to combat other groups. What do you guys think?
One
It's all about messaging.
One important thing about it is that there is a number of studies actually that show how exactly we should tailor our message to the general public. For instance, going back to, you know, some scary therapies, I can say that there were several studies that show that people accept even scary technologies in case they are going to be used to treat severe diseases, but they reject all the same technologies in case their application looks like something like human enhancement. So it's really important to provide a correct message for a specific audience, because well, we all know that among ourselves, I mean, among like-minded people, we can exchange quite freely. I mean, we even use these things like transhumanism, singularity, future shocks, and all other things like a password, you know. And if a correct password is given, actually you can jump to discussing quite personal things, even to exchange lists of germ protectors. But this particular audience, I mean, like-minded people, our supporters, they may not be quite excited if we kind of look like a mainstream, if we are talking about only curing diseases and all. However, the general public would prefer to see these particular messages and not the radical ones.
Yeah, and like you were saying about the message, you know, some questions, you know, have an inherent assumption, right? Like your question about 200 years. I mean, your assumption is that this person is in a position that wants to live 200 years. You wouldn't go to somebody, you know, who's in life in prison saying, hey, you want another 1,000 years of life? It's like, no, what are you, crazy? Kill me tomorrow. You know, it's like you're making the assumption that, you know, that he's in a position that he wants to be in forever, right? But, you know, the other assumption is more broadly applicable. It's like, hey, do you want to have a neurodegenerative disease in 10 years and not remember, you know, how to use the bathroom? It's like, hell no, nobody. So one question has just wrong assumptions, and the other question has right assumptions. And I think we're, you know, you can't. That's the problem with sort of like the more, you know, the transhumanist stuff, is that the assumption is that, you know, I'm wealthy right now. I'm already healthy right now. I'm really happy. I'm not depressed. Everybody I know is really happy, and I want this to continue forever. So in that for that person, you know, saying you want to live 1,000 years, the assumption is like this. Hell yes, right? But you know, you can't make certain assumptions when you ask these questions. So I think rephrasing it,
especially if you're talking to someone for the first time,
right? So something that we all have in common, which is not wanting to fall apart, you know, not wanting to see our loved ones fall apart, you know, that's probably a much more fundamental base at which to, you know, approach people and talk to them, and not make these sort of assumptions where certain questions are just a little too I don't know, overly optimistic and overly assuming that your position is the same exact as my position.
And everyone also just has an inherent sort of confirmation bias, right? It's like you're comfortable hearing some information that's a little bit out of your wheelhouse that could, okay, I'm interested in that. Where if someone just comes with something way out of your wheelhouse, your knee jerk is to be like, well, that just doesn't jive with my experience, so I'm off now.
Right. I mean, you can't make those assumptions. You're assuming when you say that somebody is going to live 200 years is, again, that they're going to be living 200 years in a happy, healthy state,
and their friends are doing the same.
They're going to be just as productive for those 200 years, and they're going to be surrounded by nurturing, loving people, and, you know, and we're going to go marching towards utopia, right? That's sort of the assumption. I'm being really glib here, but you know, but a lot of people don't have that assumption.
Yeah, no, I agree. But to Elena's point, you know, our position is interesting with what we're trying to do, you know, with Lifespan and Leaf, and that to what Elena said, it's like we want to definitely engage people, but we also want, you know, our audience to know that, you know, we are addressing the aging process. We're not just trying to say, you know, just cure cancer. You know, we are after that as well. So it's very it's a refining process of, how do we be authentic with our message, but still, hit it in the right way for every audience. So that's an ongoing process. Feel free to let us know how we're doing.
Sorry.
If you think
and there's maybe another aspect to it, and that is I'm really, really happy like people like you exist and people like Elena and Steve exist, which are helping like the scientists connecting with the broader audience. So we might not have the time, we might not have the skill, we might not have the interest to actually talk to these people and tell them the right story or tell it to them in a way they can understand it. So it's really kind of important that we have specialists on that side, like specialists on advertisement or psychology or whatever you want to call it, because it just helps the field to progress quicker, and it's absolutely needed. And we like the more advocates we have, the better it is, I think. And we have different stories for different audiences, so there's nothing wrong of having like the people which like the more extreme cases and want to have like, oh, I'm only for hardcore life extension, and the other one saying like, okay, I'm a bit mild, and like if you cure AD as well, like Alzheimer as well, that's fine for me, and kind of I go with mainstream.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'm glad that the work is appreciated. To that point, I think, Steve, are there any comments coming in on Facebook that are on this topic? Advocacy in general, or questions or suggestions on Facebook? You're muted.
We can't hear you, Steve.
Technology.
Oh, do you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. For some reason, it jumbles the questions up. I haven't got anything about advocacy specifically, but I was going to say about messaging. It's really important. One of the things that people fall foul of is when someone says, well, would you like to live longer? Or would you like to live another 20 years or 30 years? They often put a number on it. And the first thing a lot of people think is, oh, 20 or 30 extra years in a wheelchair. Fantastic. Or in a care home. A lot of people hear the word, when you say longevity, they think it means more years sick. It's obviously not the aim of rejuvenation biotechnology, and it's really important how we sort of convey that message. I think it's really important because a lot of people get the wrong end of the stick, and I'm going to say it, but it's my pet peeve. People use extreme messaging as well. They say things like, "Oh, I'm going to live forever," or they'll say the horrible word that I hate, which is immortality, and people run a mile. So I think we've got to sort of be very tactical in how we present the message. We don't want to be timid. We don't want to be conservative. I think we can be upfront about what our aims are, but we've got to be careful as a community. I mean, that's not just researchers or myself or Elena. That's everybody. We need to sort of think before we sort of convey the message. It's really important. And I think that's how we're going to get people on side. Doesn't mean we have to be timid or conservative, and it doesn't mean that we have to present health span as the ultimate goal. Some people think that health span is the ultimate goal. I don't share that opinion, and I'm sure a lot of you here don't. I want more health, and I want more years. I want more of the good stuff.
Yeah, I want to be
that's what it's all about.
I want to be ascension ball of plasma energy.
Going to space. 2001.
Well, we could do a Kickstarter for that, Oliver, if you like. Let's sponsor Oliver to become a pure energy being. I'm imagining something like from Star Trek, the original TV series. Sorry, it's pop culture time, Keith. Yeah. And I reckon you could be in a new a sort of reboot of Star Trek.
I'll go for
Ascension Nebula. That's what I'll say.
Okay, I'll go for 2001 Space Baby. But yeah, to that point, I think it's the trick there is to also always be authentic, right? I don't think we do, or we don't want to fall into the situation where you have like a public position and a private position, right? I think it's like rays of light, or shining on different aspects of the one truth, right? So in this point, I think it's totally fair to say, we want to cure diseases. We want people to live healthier. And in fact, if you look at the statistics on the matter, the only, I think it's a really important point to show that the only way you're going to get significant life extension is if you get significant health extension. You don't get one without the other, because if once you're super frail, even if aging was frozen, you're so frail that you're going to fall and break your hip. You're going to get pneumonia. You're not going to persist in that state. So it's actually, so that nightmare scenario is kind of like maximized by the situation we have right now in our healthcare system, and what we're trying to do will actually make it better.
When I was on that, this just one very specific example. When I was on the God, there was aging kick in. Ernie Anastas. When I was on the Ernie Anastas on Fox News, like he asked me like what was my prediction, like in the future, and I said my prediction that within my lifespan, I'd like to see the first 200-year-old person win a marathon, and I think that kind of viscerally summed it up for me. That when you say, oh, I'd like to see a 200-year-old person, that opens up a lot of people saying, what, on a ventilator? But you say, I want to see a 200-year-old person win a marathon. Well, obviously you can't win a marathon if you're frail and sick and falling apart.
And everybody loves those stories when you see a 100-year-old marathon.
So phrasing it in that perspective, it's like I like to see an Olympics where the participants are all 500 years old, right? I mean, that is basically what we're looking for, right? That's what we're aiming at.
So I think you can still totally focus on curing diseases and health, but I do think that if someone, because I have some, not complaints, but certain advocates I've seen in public talks have, in my opinion, shied away from this. That, I think it's fine to focus on health, but if someone were to ask you point blank, hey, do you want to live 200 years? I don't think if you really care about it, you should be shy or cowardly in saying, listen, from my perspective right now, I love life. I love my friends. And if this is what can persist, right, from my perspective right now, I would like to persist that until the future and let my future self decide. I don't think you should be ashamed to say, I love life.
Right, but again, that's the assumption that's just whittling it down to a number, and like if you see if you go on the news and somebody runs a marathon at age 90, nobody says, oh man, that's freaking horrible. Like everybody's cheering them on, saying, "Oh my God, I wish I was like this person." If I were to ask you, right, if I were to ask an average person on the street right now, and ask them, do you want to live to 100? Some of them are going to shy away and say, "No, not really, because I'm going to be like a real pile of crap, and I don't want to be 100." But if you say, "Hey, but almost everybody I know, when they see a story about a 100-year-old person finishing a marathon, going, "Holy shit, I want to be that guy." Everybody, like I don't know one person who turns around and says, nah, I wish I was in bed and I'm like just frail. I don't want to be like this guy. Everybody says, I want to be that guy or that girl or whoever it is that's 100 and finishing that race, right? So it's not the years that people aren't afraid of living forever. It's just the assumption is, and it's a correct assumption given on our current technology and how people are treated, that you are going to be a burden on everybody and you are going to be sick and you're going to be wishing you were dead for the next 40 years. And, and I think it is kind of, it is, we try to get around that, but it is not, I think, an illogical assumption for people to make, because that's what they see. That's how people are treated. People end up in hospice and they don't want to be like that. But when you actually show them proof positive of somebody doing something like climbing a mountain at age 95, almost everybody says, holy shit, I want to be that person, And so I don't think it's, aging is not something, and aging healthy and living healthy for a long time, as long as possible, is not something I think people are adverse to. It's just fundamentally being ill and in pain and suffering and being trapped in, a body that's basically their torture chamber, for X amount of years. That's what people are afraid of. Yeah. Rightly so, because that's how people exist right now. For a lot of cases.
So that's the Tinnitus error, I'm afraid, isn't it? It's a classic. It's the Tinnitus error. It's, like I said earlier, it's the word longevity equals, oh, would you like to live another 20 years? And that instantly in many people's minds is another 20 years in a wheelchair. But the interesting thing is there's just been a study released this month, actually, in Australia, that shows that the longer people are living, the longer their health span is. So we're not actually having more years of decrepitude. That period has actually shrunk towards the end, like a compression of morbidity at the end of life. So the longer that the people are each year they're gaining. And the thing in the study was, and I'll dig this out and send it to you if you like, was they're finding that people are gaining more healthy years at a quicker rate as well, which is really interesting because, that compression of morbidity is occurring. So if we push that out, I honestly think it would probably keep pushing away. So you would delay the onset of diseases. We don't know until we get there. But I mean, look at examples like Jean Claremont. I mean, she remained active and up until about, an independent, up till around about 115. If I recall, she set fire to her kitchen. And that was, at that point, they said, well, come on now, look, enough's enough. But a lot of supersanitarians have remained extremely active and independent right until the very end. So it kind of sort of verifies that compression of morbidity is occurring thanks to current healthcare, and it's getting better. And I think it's only going to get better over time. And as rejuvenation biotechnology comes in, well, I mean, what the possibilities are crazy. I'm excited.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. So definitely, if whatever is open, feel free to drop links in the comments of this talk so people can to check that out. And also related to the like Steve had mentioned before, the Greek myth of Tithonus, which is an interesting example of sort of this fear that we have to overcome with our messaging. But I think we're probably coming up on time pretty soon, so I'm going to start to wind this down. I see Elena has her hand up, so maybe one last comment from you, and then I'll move things to the final phase.
Yes, awesome. Well, I just wanted to point out that, again, there are many studies that are investigating how public reacts to different messages, and one that I find particularly interesting is the one done by Brad Partridge and his colleagues. It was on Australian population, and there were some 600 participants, if I'm not mistaken. The funny part about this study was that in the introduction text, there was said that actually the scientists are aiming to extend healthy period of life by slowing down the processes of aging. However, about 1/3 of the participants still named as a concern the extension of unhealthy and frail period of life. So what should this tell us? I believe it should tell us that people don't really understand what aging is, what are mechanisms of aging, and how they are related to the onset of age-related diseases. So my call will be just to start with the basics and to explain as much as possible before going to things like life extension, longevity, and benefits of longevity or something. Because people don't really know about these things as much as we do. And so it's very hard for them to imagine how exactly the layout of their life is going to be if all these technologies are applied.
Right. Absolutely. Anybody have any final comments on that before I wind things down? All right. So the kind of final point I want to leave everybody with, and allow everyone here to say their own words on it, is one thing that I think works against the speed of this movement developing, and true for anything, is that if you're an outsider, you're a layperson just getting involved or watching on the sidelines, you look at organizations like SENS or maybe us or whatever, and you think that we are like monolithic. They got everything under control. They have all the help they need. But, I can tell you just from my own experience with us and the organizations we deal with, everybody needs help. So whether it's, financial is obvious, but, help on boots on the ground, someone to help with social media, someone to help doing graphic design, anything. If you are passionate about this, there are hooks in even to SENS. So I want to kind of go around the room here, let everyone say, if there's anything that you personally could benefit from that would help the movement and help this cause in any way, feel free to just educate people, let them know how they can contact you, how they can get involved. So feel free, anybody jump in. Because we'll start with...
and then let me start on it, because we already have platforms like I mentioned now, Longevity City. So these platforms already exist where people can like hook up with kind of labs around or people around and try to engage with them. Like it can be as simple as like, I need a good homepage. Like everyone these days has basic skills in making nice homepages. It's kind of like data gathering. Everyone can kind of like read, like not everyone, but fairly many people can read papers and kind of it's very simple things, and people can't really seem to think of like how they can help. But even if you don't know, just ask, and or maybe you have a special skill, put it in the forum, leave a message of saying like, I want to be engaged. And I think if you really kind of truly kind of able to do and willing to do, we find a job for you. It's like there's so many things around. It's really difficult to list them all, and I think people have already made lists. In Long SCT, I can remember that there were long lists of like, how can you contribute? If it's like science, go here. If it's art, go here. If it's whatever daily life, go here. So yeah, that's my point on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a longevity forum that Alexandra was mentioning, which is a good forum for connecting with other people interested in this topic. I can speak for Leaf, and therefore I guess speak a little bit for Steve and Elena. I know that what would support us, obviously, is our future campaigns on lifespan.io, and we have that hero campaign for longevity heroes that want to help us directly, lifespan.io/hero. And on the personal side, we could definitely use help with web development, graphic design, web quality assurance. So please feel free to reach out. We're very responsive. We also have a newsletter you can sign up for. And also in general, what we're doing here, it might look easy. Hopefully it does, but it's actually complicated to do the streaming with the groups, the Facebook. So people who have that skill, I want to shout out a person who's helping us, whose code name is Wubbit, who's kind of manning this behind the scenes. So thumbs up there. I'm expecting an LOL or something to appear in the chat. So, anything like that would help us. So I think, I'm going to wind it down. So any final comments or words of wisdom or anything anyone wants to offer before we officially round it down?
Yeah, if I may. Sorry, Steve, just a few lines. Well, my point is our community is quite atomized, but this is not the only problem. The other problem is that people don't really feel that volunteering for some pro-longevity organization is quite a serious thing. And so there is a lot of people who come, do very, very few things, and then go. I believe it's nice to satisfy your pride as a longevity supporter, but this is not enough in case you want really to foster progress in terms of development of rejuvenation technologies. So my call to everyone, contacting us is obviously very easy. You can just fill a form for volunteers. You can do the same thing on the Sense side because they need your support. But then probably the best thing of all will be to be serious about it.
Yeah, I think the good upside of that is that, branching off of what Elena is saying, what matters, in my opinion, far more than even skill set is passion and reliability and wanting to do something and having that there. Like, I would much rather work with a pretty good graphic designer who is super passionate than an amazing graphic designer who sort of cares, right? So I think that's a really good point. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in our audience that really care. So if anything, I want to just convey that sense that there is work for you to do, and especially for we get a lot of messages sometimes of people that are let's be honest, a little bit upset or a little bit scared, or thinking about aging really depresses me, or et cetera, et cetera. And this is my own personal philosophy, so you don't have to adopt it, but I think there's no greater panacea for that kind of worrying than doing the work, than getting in the trenches and acting. So if there's anything that I want to leave the audience with, it is with that. But just to close things down, I think this is an excellent panel. So thank you everyone for joining. Again, this is sort of new for us, but we would like to do these sort of things more often. So if the audience is left with any questions or they want to see us to do more things like this, definitely suggest that. And I'd like to thank everyone, audience and panelists, for showing up, and let's all, help fight the diseases of aging together. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks.